Welcome everybody to the 2024 version of CSW training. If you make sure you're all in the right place, we're here for the basic training for CSW68. And we're going to run through a range of different things during this session, but one of the key things that I think will be important for us here is that this is a space for you to be able to ask your questions. Because we have a recorded version of this presentation from previous years that's available if there's any information that you want to go back to or think about a little bit more. But in the interim, what we want is a space where people are really going to be able to dig into some of the things that are confusing them about CSW, or some of the things that they may not have come across before. Or if you're a complete first timer, some of the really basic questions that can really help everybody if you ask them. So I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people in Canberra today, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I'd just like to note the incredible importance of the work that's done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocates in this space. I have been to a good number of CSWs now, and the people who have, I think, made the most clear impact in that space over that last 10 years that I've been going have been the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates. And I think that it's very important that we reflect when we go into this process on just how difficult it is to be a part of a CSW delegation, and in particular how difficult it is to be a person of colour, a person with disability, or a person who comes from an otherwise marginalised population or experiences intersectional discrimination in this space. So if any of those things apply to you, do feel free to ask questions about that during this session today. And I'm going to just share my screen so that people can see some slides. How's that? Can everybody see those? Give me a thumbs up on the emojis would be helpful. And the reason I'm asking you to do that as a first step is that we're going to ask a couple of questions where I'm going to need you to be able to use the thumbs up signal. So have a look for me and see if you can find the little smiley face that will then give you the ability to be able to use thumbs up. I'm seeing some people that can do it already. This is brilliant. Okay. And the reason I wanted to start with that, and we'll get everybody to pop your thumbs down now if there still are, is I just want to know how many people here have actually been to CSW before and how many people are going for their first time. So if it's your first time, can I get a thumbs up? Okay, we've got a good sprinkling. This is excellent. Right, good. Then we are going to do some of the really, the basic stuff, which can sometimes be some of the most interesting stuff in some ways when you're at this point of the stage where we're already through the zero draft and we're up to the stage of actually thinking, what am I actually going to pack? What do I need to have by the time I go? So we'll do some of that stuff. We're also going to cover some of why we do CSW and what it is that CSW actually does. And we're going to cover some of the trickier stuff around language, if we get to it, and some of the reasons for understanding why we're doing what we're doing in this space. So that's quite a lot to chew through. Having said that, I do want you to interrupt with questions. So if you have questions as they come up, pop them into the chat, and Maddie's going to be watching those. And Maddie, you just shout out and say, we've got a question, and tell me what it is. And that's basically our mode of operations. So CSW68, it is, as the name suggests, the 68th meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, which takes place in New York every year in March. It's the only bit of the UN that focuses purely on gender equality. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you think about some of the stuff I'll talk about later about the politics of this. So CSW, get our slides going, is an interesting space, and anyone who amongst us who've already been there will be able to attest to this. It's a space where there are really three simultaneous things happening. The first is that the Commission itself is meeting, and they are producing a document called the Agreed Conclusions and holding a meeting over a number of days which covers a whole range of different things. Then in addition to that meeting, there's a side event program, which is states and UN instrumentalities, holding events which highlight what's happening in the world of gender equality across the globe, and which are also an opportunity for us to be able to think about what the future might be in relation to our work. Then in addition to that, there's the parallel events going on. So that's a separate sort of festival of events happening, a conference structure, which happens outside the UN building, but which is happening simultaneously. And so most people who attend CSW will be doing something from all three of those pools. The technical stuff about CSW is it's the principal global intergovernmental body that's the only one that's exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality, as I was saying. And it's a functional commission of the Economic Social Council, ECOSOC. It was established way back in 1946, and Australia has a really big history with CSW. Jessie Street, one of our early pioneers in the space, was heavily involved in the establishment of CSW. And originally, CSW was a space to discuss the rights of women in the development of the human rights framework at the UN. And then when the treaty on the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women came along, it became the primary space for discussing the implementation of that treaty. Then in 1995, we had the Fourth World Conference on Women, which produced the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And ever since 1995, the point of CSW has been to monitor and assist in the implementation of that platform for action. So that's the aim of CSW. It's also got a role in relation to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs. And the idea there is that it's supposed to keep an eye on what's happening in the SDG space and be able to then move that across into the work that's happening at CSW. There we go. So the reason we participate in CSW is that it actually performs a really important role in terms of the nexus between the work that we do at home in our communities and the work that is being done across the globe. It's one of the few spaces where we can actually get together with people out on a mass scale and start to exchange ideas at a level which takes us beyond the minutiae of what's happening in our communities and starts to help us to see the broader trends that underpin some of the discrimination and the inequality that we're seeing. So CSW itself, as I said, allows for discussion on issues within the Beijing agenda. It also brings visibility to issues that are emerging. And we saw that last year with CSW67, which was about gender equality in the digital world, or issues that are sliding off the agenda a little bit. And I want to raise a quick red flag here to say that there was no language about Indigenous women in the first draft of the agreed conclusions that we saw earlier this week. And so it has two roles there in relation to spotting what's coming over the horizon and spotting what it is that we've lost our focus on. It's also an opportunity for direct advocacy with governments, particularly those governments who might be working in similar spaces to us, but with whom we have very little contact. And some of the examples of that might be European states and that sort of thing. So it's a place to be able to get outside your normal circle, outside your shell, and to be able to discuss ideas with like-minded states, and critically to be able to discuss ideas with non-like-minded states in an attempt to try and shift the norms globally. CSW itself, the structure is that it's 45 member states of the UN who all sit as members of the Commission. So when we talk about the Commission, we're talking about those 45 member states. And they have elections for those positions, and those elections are divided up, the positions available are divided up according to geographic groupings. So you get 13 from Africa, 11 from Asia, 9 from Latin America and the Caribbean, 8 from Western Europe and other states, and 4 from Eastern Europe. And so the Commission is sort of comprised of candidates from those groupings in those numbers. You get elected for 4 years, and Australia has just finished a term on CSW, so it'll be a little while before we sit on it again. And as I was saying earlier, the primary focus for CSW is on the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action, which is now coming up to being, what, 25 years old? and is a document which is showing its age in some regards because it is limited in its coverage of things like the modern digital world. Its coverage of violence against women, we would now raise our eyebrows at a little bit. And a couple of other areas are starting to show their age. But those 12 critical areas covered in the Beijing Platform for Action are set out there. And in its time, it was absolutely the high watermark in relation to gender equality. Since that time, the political environment that we've experienced in both CSW and more broadly has meant that it hasn't been felt to be safe to hold a further welcome convention on women. And consequently, we haven't had an update to the Beijing document. The consensus at the moment is that if we did hold such a meeting, we would get a document which took us backwards. And so at the moment, we're hanging on to the 1995 document, but there will come a point where we can't keep doing that anymore. And that will be one of the live issues that you'll hear about at CSW. We did, however, hold Generation Equality last year, which was last year or the year before, apologies, which was an attempt to do a world conference which didn't open up the Beijing Platform for Action, but instead focused on the development of a range of action plans that operated out of different areas. That information is all available, linked to the UN Women website. And so if you're interested, or if you come across language that comes from the Generation Equality process, have a bit of a dig for that, but I will be sending some information about it on the e-list for those who are interested.
Helen, we've just got a question that's come through.
The Beijing Platform for Action itself is mostly about what states have to do, but it also has some space around what public, private and non-governmental sectors need to be doing. And then it's got regional approaches as well embedded in it. We've seen at CSW that approach has very much come down to the regional responsibilities and the state level responsibilities, with very little engagement of public and private interests in those spaces. The other big area that is engaged in the Beijing platform and Beijing Platform for Action is the NGO sector. When you're at CSW, you often hear it referred to as the civil society organisations, CSO. So if I use CSO instead of NGO, they're basically the same thing. What Beijing did was it set time-specific targets to carry out concrete actions in relation to those 12 priority areas. And its ultimate goal was the elimination of discrimination against women in both public and private life. So when we go to CSW, we've got those 3 areas of activity that I was talking about earlier. And the key one, the core one being the work done by the Commission. The primary output of that is a document called the Agreed Conclusions. The process for developing the Agreed Conclusions is already underway. It started at the beginning of last week with the release of what's called the Zero Draft. Prior to that, we had a couple of other processes, including the convening of an expert group at the end of last year, who produced a series of documents which are all available on the UN Women website, which talk about the priority theme for CSW. The Secretary-General's office then produced a report on the priority theme, which then formed the basis for the Zero Draft, which came out last week. So the drafting of that set of agreed conclusions and the negotiations around it have already started. And those agreed conclusions contain a bit of an assessment of progress and then identifies the gaps and challenges that relate to the priority theme, and then makes a whole series of concrete recommendations that the states who participate have all agreed to about what governments, intergovernmental bodies, regional groupings, civil society and other actors will do in order to advance implementation of gender equality in relation to the priority theme. So, priority theme, which is accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. Each year we also have a review theme. And this year it is social protection systems, access to public services and sustainable infrastructure for gender equality. So those 2 themes, it's the priority theme that you'll see most emphasis on at CSW. And you'll notice that it's got 3 specific parts to it. It's got poverty, got strengthening institutions, and it's got financing. And to be perfectly frank, the poverty piece is starting to get a little bit less attention, particularly in the zero draft, than the strengthening institutions and financing piece. And the reason for that is that the financing piece in particular, but also strengthening institutions, is highly political. And so it's going to take a lot of the energy. So it's one of the jobs that we have as NGOs in this space is to be able to push the poverty piece harder to make sure that in the horse trading that happens around the politics, we don't lose the important part about gendered poverty and the feminisation of poverty. The other things that you'll see coming out of CSW is that there are resolutions which are put forward by member states of the Commission. They're often around the situation of and assistance to Palestinian women, the girl child, women and the girl child, and HIV and AIDS. There's no indication yet, or at least I'm not aware of any indication yet about what the resolutions will be this year. So if anybody does have any information about that, chuck it in the chat for us, because that would be really useful. But I think it's very clear that there will be one about Palestinian women and girls. It's also likely, I would think, that there will be one about anti-Semitism faced by women and girls. And I would be very surprised if there wasn't also one about women and girls in occupied territories, which would be sponsored by states who are keeping an eye on what's happening in the Ukraine. Then every 5 years, this whole structure goes out the window and we have a review year. The review year next is coming up next year in 2025. And in that year, instead of agreed conclusions, what you get is a political declaration. You get work on what the themes will be for the next 5 years and how they're going to go about organising themselves. And in that year, as I said, we get no agreed conclusions. So we're in a normal year, we've got our priority theme, and we're going to get our agreed conclusions, we've got our fingers crossed. So a quick overview of the sorts of things that happen at CSW over the 2 weeks. In week 1, and apologies, the dates there are actually incorrect, it starts on the 11th, not the 12th. What you'll see is advocacy strategies being worked out between groups, both NGO groups, caucuses of different NGO groups, regional level caucuses, and between states and negotiating parties. We'll be working out what their advocacy strategies will be. There'll be training sessions run by various different caucuses, rather like this one. And there'll be various reception events, formal events where people come together and network and effectively work out what it is that they're going to be working through together in the next 2 weeks. And the NGO CSW forum kicks off. This is the third of those 3 circles that I was talking about. So side events, parallel events, and the core commission work and the agreed conclusions. The parallel events are run through the NGO CSW forum, which you can sign up for now. I'll have the web address up later to get yourself a timetable of all the parallel events that are on. So that kicks off in the first week. The other thing that kicks off in the 3rd week is that 3rd piece, which is the side events and government-sponsored events that are run by UN instrumentalities and other functionaries, and events that are sponsored by the UN itself. And those events primarily will be run within the UN building, but you'll find that increasingly some of them are being held in missions. Australia, for example, last year held 2 events outside the UN building because the amount of space that's available for internal events is starting to shrink. So they'll be inside and outside, and the parallel events will all be outside. The other things that happen is in that first week, you see the government delegations at their strongest. So ministers for women will be there, other ministers may be there. Representatives from the Human Rights Commission and other bodies, comparative bodies from around the world will all be there. And they will make a number of statements publicly and to the Commission. Our minister is likely, if she's able to attend, to make a statement about our progress. And if not, someone from the delegation will make that statement on her behalf. There are also a series of events called ministerials, and those ministerial events are chaired often by ministers, and that work tends to happen in this first week because that's when the ministers are still in country. Then we start the negotiations somewhere around Wednesday, while all the other events are still running in parallel. And then in week 2, it all gets a lot smaller. So ministers and a lot of the CSO delegates leave, and the parallel and side events will continue, but they'll start to scale back a little bit. And the focus then becomes very much on the negotiations and what's actually happening within the UN building. Any questions so far?
We have a bunch of questions. Hopefully people can hear me this time. Can people hear me?
Okay,
Yes.
if you keep going then.
No.
So when you first get to New York, what you're looking for is this building.
Helen,
Can
you hear me?
That's
Maybe she can't hear anyone.
Very hard to photograph. That's the best way to find it. It's down
Helen?
on the east side of Manhattan, as you'll see from the map there. And this all seems
Hello?
Helen, I don't think she can hear anyone.
It's useful to have got your head around it. I strongly suggest that you go on Google Maps and work out what the route is from your hotel to the UN building, because although it's a grid system, you can actually get yourself quite confused, particularly about distances in Manhattan. So make sure that you've done a little bit of pre-research about how to get yourself to the first place and the second place you need to get to. And the second place you need to get to is a particularly important one, because that's the one where you're going to get your pass that will allow you into the building.
And someone has asked, given that Australia's membership tenure has just ended, what does that mean for Australia's representation and the impact on Australia for this year?
Good question. Very little. In fact, there's a point where there is a discussion starting very slowly about the composition of CSW and about whether or not the limited nature of it is actually suitable to what happens. Because what happens is that small group of organisations that turn up as members then sit alongside everybody else who turns up, and everybody continues to be involved as though they're on the commission, and up to and including the Vatican. Like, everybody is there. Having said everybody is there, it's important to look at who actually isn't there, because quite often, particularly small island states and developing nations aren't able to put people in the room. Those states who are on the commission, who are developing states, make a bit more of an effort to be in the room in the years when they're on the commission. Australia goes every year and effectively behaves much the same way, regardless of whether they're on the commission or not. So in terms of the strength of our negotiating position, it doesn't make much of a difference. The one thing that it does make a difference to is that when we're on the commission, we're much more likely to take a proactive role. So we were actually one of the vice chairs of the commission during our tenure. And so that meant that we were heavily involved at governmental level and mission level in the actual organisation and running of CSW. So that's the main difference.
We have a couple more questions in the chat that I might keep giving to you. So can attendees who are not part of the Australian delegation attend the presentation by the Australian government?
Yes. So the thing that gets you into the official proceedings is having an ECOSOC accredited pass. So all the people who have got themselves a pass and had to sign up through the Indicio website, and UN Women, you have an ECOSOC accredited pass, which will allow you to get a grounds pass, which gets you into the UN building. All the proceedings, all the formal proceedings of CSW are open. Having said that, there are usually a limited number of seats for people, and so if you want to see a particular minister speak or a particular state present, then you need to get yourself into the building and into the room early to make sure that you're allowed in. But what we usually do is we get a heads up from the Australian government mission about when they think the minister is likely to speak, and we'll then get ourselves into the room at the start of that session, because they can run short or long, and so we can't say exactly when she'll speak. So that's the main way to get there. It's harder to get into a ministerial roundtable that the minister is sharing because they tend to be crowded out by people who have delegate passes. So delegate passes being people who are on the official delegation.
We have another question related, which is, do we have details of Australian government side events yet?
No, we don't. So for people who want to know things about what the Australian government delegation is doing, there are a couple of places to go. The first is the pre-departure briefing that's on the 20th of February. If you haven't got a calendar invitation from me for that, let me know and I'll send you one. That briefing, at that briefing, they'll introduce us to the members of the delegation and they'll tell us what their priorities for the negotiations and for the rest of their activities are. And then they should also at that point be able to tell us about their side events and any other events that they're running. So there is often an event on the Sunday before the start of CSW, which is a welcome at the Australian mission to the UN. And that's for NGOs. So I have been asked by Office for Women to supply a list of names. So you're about to get an email from me saying, do you mind if I give your email address to the Australian government? And if you can get back to me quickly, if you do care, that would be really good, because otherwise I will send the email list of emails out to Australia. They'll then send you an invitation. You need an invitation to the Sunday night event if they hold it in order to get into the secure building that it's held in. And then the side events, the ones that are held in the UN, you'll need your UN pass to get into those, your ECOSOC pass. However, if they hold events outside the UN, which I expect they will, invitations to those will be issued separately through the email list that you should all be on. And if you're not getting emails from me about CSW, let me know and we'll get you on that list. The other place to get information is the 5 p.m. briefings, and I'll talk a bit more about them later. But basically, we all try to find a spot to meet up every day at 5 p.m. so that all the NGOs and a couple of people from the government delegation can get together, share information and so on. And thanks, Joe's just pointing out in the list that if you can't get in for the speeches or you can't get into the room, they're all broadcast on web TV, which is on the UN website.
I think this is the final question that we have in the chat for right now, which is
sorry, Maddie,
go for it.
In terms of the Australian government side event, just for people's planning, I understand that it will be on Tuesday, the 12th of March at, I think it is 1:45 to 2:45. So just if you're scheduling, don't schedule things at that time.
Fantastic. And Maddie, what was the next question?
Our final question that we have at the moment is, what is the difference between the agreed conclusions and resolutions?
Yeah, good question. So the resolutions are a little bit like General Assembly resolutions in that they are a statement from the Commission rather than from all the states. They're a statement from the Commission about a particular topic area, and they are debated separately from the agreed conclusions. They can be about anything relating to a matter that arises under the Beijing Platform for Action, and generally speaking, they can be about any matter that enough people are prepared to support. So they're a little bit more loosey-goosey, and they're a little bit more political. And to say that they're more political than the agreed conclusions, anybody who's actually been to CSW will know that that means they're highly political indeed. The agreed conclusions, however, aren't just a statement of a position. They're a statement of things states are agreeing to do. So they're actually a commitment by the states involved. And while technically speaking, it's a commitment of the states who form the Commission, in practice, we've had situations in the past where non-commissioned states have regularly got in the way of negotiations or slowed negotiations down to the point where negotiations have stalled, or we've been unable in one case to get agreed conclusions 1 year. So increasingly, we're treating the non-commissioned states as though they too are necessary to the consensus that's required for agreed conclusions. So agreed conclusions are a consensus document, and which is why it's so easy to derail the negotiations. So when we come out with agreed conclusions, we're coming out with a document where all the states, technically, who are involved in the negotiations have agreed to these actions.
Yeah.
And there's a question from Therese in the chat there. In addition to gaining information about government presentations and roundtables, can we exchange parallel sessions? We certainly can. There are going to be two ways of doing that. The first is through the email list that we're all signed up to. And the nice thing about that is that it's allowing us to talk both between the people who are in New York and the people who are back home in Australia. There is, through the NGO CSW forum, there is a hybrid component. And UNTV allows people to watch various parts of the proceedings online. And so there will be people back here in Australia who'll be interested in who's presenting what and so on. So the email list is a good spot. The other two places are the 5 p.m. briefings for just giving people a heads up, but more formally being able to distribute things through the WhatsApp group that we're going to establish for people who are actually in New York. So there are 3 WhatsApp groups. One of them is for people who will be in New York and want to talk about what's going on. One is for people who specifically are interested in the language negotiations of the agreed conclusions. And I have a small group who are happy to be on call for language negotiations emergencies. And so if you're somebody who would like to start really digging into the language negotiations, and in particular, if you're thinking about sitting in the corridors with us late at night, that's a third group that you can be on, but most people don't need to be on that one. Yes, there will be a briefing document with all this, Jess. In fact, there'll be an email about this probably next week, just after the pre-departure briefing. Once we've got all the information in place, we'll put it in one place. Other questions at this point? I'm just flicking to see if there are any hands. Nope. Okay, good. Well, in that case, I'm going to go back and just let you know a little bit about where some of those parallel events might end up being and where some of the Australian events might end up being. Give you a bit of a physical look at that. So places that have been important in the past. And one of the things I think is important to realise is that the venues shift quite a lot, and finding venues in New York has become increasingly difficult over the last couple of years. The UN itself is a lot busier than it used to be. They used to effectively close down the UN building for everybody except CSW participants, and that meant that we had the whole area and all the available rooms. For the last couple of, well, certainly for last year, the General Assembly sat at the same time as CSW, and that meant that there was much less space available. So a lot of side events started to get moved out of the UN building. So the UN building itself down there is down on the river in the lower right-hand side of the map. But other places you might end up going is the Australian Mission, there right in the middle. Previously, the Australian government delegation has been at the Western Hotel, but last year that wasn't the case, so we'll wait and see this time. Places that parallel events get held include 4 West 43rd Street, which is known as the NGO Centre, the Salvation Army Centre, which is way up here in the top right-hand corner, the Armenian Convention Centre, which is way down towards the bottom. They're the main things, and the biggest one is CCUN, which is the Churches Centre UN. If you've got to get from the UN building to CCUN, you're just crossing the road, and the main thing you've got to do is negotiate getting out of the UN building. If you need, however, to get to 4 West 43rd Street, way over on the left-hand side, just to give you an idea, you see Grand Central Terminal there. From Grand Central to the UN is an 11-minute walk. So it takes you the better part of 20 minutes to get to 4 West. And to get there from the UN, that's an uphill walk. So that starts to give you a bit of a sense of what it might mean to you to be able to have to move during the day between the UN building and other areas. Do use Google Maps again to work out how long things are likely to take walking. But be aware that walking at different times of the day in New York is more or less difficult depending on whether it's rush hour. In particular, anything that's happening just before 9 or anything around 5, you're going to have a slower trip walking to a venue. Any thoughts about that? Haven't lost you all again, have I? I keep minimizing you and you all disappear. No, there you all are. Good. Okay. So we've had a look at what happens over the 2 weeks. In a typical day at CSW, the sorts of things you might be doing, and this will differ hugely for those who might be involved in a government delegation and those who are attending as CSO representatives. This is more of a CSO focus. In a typical day, it can often start really early. My first caucus briefings most days will be at 7 a.m. And we have to get there from the hotel. You start the day, if you're not at a caucus meeting where you're exchanging information, working out what your strategy for the day is, you'll be going through your comms and trying to work out what exactly happened yesterday, what that means for today, and whether or not the meetings that you intended to hold today are still going to go ahead. That last one is particularly relevant for anybody who's interacting with government delegations, because the timings for government delegations shift rapidly and quickly. So if you've set up a meeting with somebody's mission, for example, you need to make sure that you've checked in at the beginning of the day to see that they're still on track for you. During the day, you go to side events or parallel events. You might be doing social media, you might be doing comms work. In my case, I spend a lot of time sitting in various cafes within the UN building, banging away at the computer, doing redrafts of agreed conclusions documents. Anybody who's very excited by that is very welcome to come and find me. I will always be telling you on WhatsApp where I am. And other people might be getting involved in other activities, either outside the UN or within the UN building itself. So people tend to do things like tee up meetings with potential funding partners for programs, or meet up with delegations of NGOs who are working in the same area as you, but in a different region. So those sorts of interactions can be really helpful to people who have gone to CSW with an agenda to build their networks and their working partnerships. So a lot of that happens during the day. And then in the evenings at 5 p.m, as I said, we'll have our briefing with someone from the Australian government delegation. There are functions, and if you have existing networks that have a presence in New York, so if you're part of a world network in some way, it's worth checking to see whether they're doing anything during CSW, whether they're holding a function. And then for people like me, you'll be preparing summaries of language positions that we might want to be using the next day, fact sheets to deal with issues that have become contentious in the room, that sort of thing. Has anyone got an idea of what they're going to be doing at CSW that sounds different to any of that? Because there are all sorts of permutations of this, and it can be really interesting to hear different people's CSW experiences. Not at this point. Cool. That's something that we will check in on at the 5 p.m s, and that we will share a little bit of information about through the email, so that we start to get a little bit of a feeling from people about what different CSW experiences look like, because they can be very different. For example, I've worked with Aboriginal delegates from NGOs going to CSW who've got quite a packed program of meeting with organisations around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So what can happen is different networks that have focuses that include women and girls, but aren't necessarily limited to that, can use CSW as a space to be doing some intense networking where everybody can finally get face-to-face and do some talking. So you'll probably see quite a bit of work, for example, among the Pacific Island states and their allies in different parts of the world around climate change and language around that. Practicalities. CSW, we've got a good number of people on the call who've been to CSW before, and I just want to throw this out quickly for a moment. For those of you who've been, share a couple of words about the weather.
Well, where do we begin, Heather? Hi, I'm Margaret Augurenos, everyone. Sorry, I've got my camera off because, you know, it's just easier to see the screen. Yeah, so I've been to CSW a few times, and I've had weather that's ranged from some of the last days. I remember there was t-shirt weather, and we've also had significant snow events, blizzards and storms, which shut the whole city down for 2 or 3 days. And there was one CSW where they said everything, the UN's closing, nothing's happening. So, you know, for 2 or 3 days, there was literally nothing, no events, and we were snowed in. We couldn't go anywhere. So be prepared. Wear shoes with grips is what I say. Don't go along with your smooth-soled RM Williams boots like I did one year and nearly broke my neck. You really need to prepare for snow and ice.
Yeah, and if you're really wedded to your heels, carry them in a backpack and put them on when you are in the UN building. Otherwise, it's boots. Yeah, thanks, Margaret, because that's, I think it is difficult to convey just how varied the weather can be. I've seen daffodils bloom in Central Park during CSW, and as Margaret says, I've been to 2 CSWs where the UN has been closed due to blizzard. So you need to be prepared for quite a range. You need to be prepared for really hot buildings, buildings that have been heated since Thanksgiving, and consequently have really built up a head of steam, and yet it being really quite cold outside. Puffer jackets that you can stuff into a stuff sack and then put in a backpack are really quite useful here. Someone want to add something? Nope, cool. Other things that you need to know as a matter of practicality, they enforce the New York State and New York City both enforce the rules around fire protection quite stringently, which means there's a real limit on how many people they're allowed to put in rooms. They will close rooms when they're full. And the rooms will fill up, particularly in the second week when there aren't as many events on. You'll find that it's actually quite hard to get a seat in events that you were really looking forward to getting to. So when you're doing that exercise I was talking about with distances, make sure that you add in, and I need to be there 15 minutes early in order to get yourself into the room. Make sure you get a seat, or at least that you don't get thrown out. Make sure you carry some snacks. Food at the UN is not great. It's expensive and it's heavy on meat. There will be very few vegan and only a few vegetarian options available. There will be, you'll be able to find some kosher and some halal, but not a lot. Your options won't be great. And so do carry food with you. You're allowed to bring it in. They're sometimes funny about liquids and hot liquids at security, but you can always refill water in the UN building. It's having something you can carry it with that's important. Anyone want to add something? I've got someone coming through. Okay, just check everybody, you're on mute, just in case. The other thing that I highly recommend as a matter of practicality is to only rely on your electronic calendar to a certain degree. Prepare yourself a spreadsheet of some kind about what your day looks like. And the reason for that is that we've had lots of people in the past who've had difficulty with the time zones, particularly if you are, for some reason, I'm not sure why this happens, but we've seen people who have logged into meetings, particularly online meetings that are being held in Australia, and have found that their laptops reset their time zones as a result without them realizing it, and things disappear because they're appearing at 1 a.m. In the morning. So use an Excel spreadsheet or something similar to organize yourself, or even print yourself out a copy of something. And do think about whether you can get an eSIM or some other form of connectivity, because outside the UN building, UN Wi-Fi itself is not great, and New York City Wi-Fi is pretty patchy. You'll find some locations will provide it, but there's nothing like what I'm used to here in Canberra, where we have CBD Wi-Fi everywhere. So you may find that you need Wi-Fi in places you can't get it. So have a think about whether you're going to get yourself an eSIM or something similar to give yourself some connectivity. I recommend a backpack. Shoulder bags are all very well, but you'll be carrying heavy stuff all day, and you will start to feel it, particularly if you're there for the 2 weeks. Cabs are quite expensive, and with Uber, at least you know the price up front, so do think about that. And if you're moving outside that zone of area where the UN events are being held and the CSW events are being held. The subway is far and away the cheapest option for you getting around Manhattan. If you don't have an ECOSOC pass, but you do want to go to a side event that's inside the UN building, you can sometimes get an invitation. Contact the organisers and they can get you an invitation that'll get you into the UN building. And there are also tours available if you weren't able to get an ECOSOC pass and you did want to see the UN while you were there. The tours are run all day, so you can go to the information desk and ask about those. If you're there in the evening, security closes the building at 6 p.m. You can stay in, but you can't get back in, which means if you think you're going to be in for an evening, make sure you've got dinner with you and make sure that you've got everything that you need by way of medications and that sort of thing. And the other quick practical thing is no protest or political comment in the UN building. And that includes T-shirts. Be prepared to stand your ground if you're being told that your T-shirt is political and it simply isn't. And a T-shirt that talks about somebody's rights, or particularly women's rights, is not political. This is the UN. And so you don't allow yourself to be pushed around by security staff because they do have a tendency to get confused about that. Juliana.
Helen, I just wanted to let people, the CSOs, know that this year we're not using, NGO CSW is not using Hoover, they use VFairs. So when you register into NGO CSW, you should also register into VFairs. That is where you get your program, your agenda, so that you can have your agenda on your phone to be able to access all the parallel events that you would like to access. I would also, being a cowed woman, I would also like to put on the platform and to the meeting that Australia sits in a very powerful position because we have a lot of participants in the CSO who are people from other countries of birth. Either you are born or you are born to parents from that country of birth, and you might speak another language or operate very well in another language. That gives us privilege into accessing other regional caucuses. So we don't only need to access the Asia Pacific Regional Caucus, you can access any other regional caucus so that you can hear what the other regions are looking at and talking about. You can make a contribution or you can take away from that and share with your Australian compatriots. That's how we did it very well in Beijing. And this year I'm aiming to, actually, I visit the African caucus all the time. I wish I could visit the MENA caucus, but it's over to you to build that into your work as you navigate CSW this year. That's for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana. And I think that's actually a critical point. It's one of the reasons to really make sure that you're checking into the 5 p.m. briefings and that you're on the WhatsApp group and on the email lists, because we will get people to share their information about when those groups are meeting. And we will try very hard to make sure that we've got a strong Australian presence in all the regional discussions. And particularly, we have an important role in making sure that the voices of Pacific Island Forum nations make it through to CSW in this space. It's not about us speaking for those nations. It's about us trying to find opportunities and protect space for those island states to be heard. And the reason I particularly raised that one is that last year at CSW, the Pacific Island states became so frustrated with the process that they actually looked at withdrawing. And that would be, appalling. So we really need to make sure that we're using the power that we have in that space as an English-speaking group that is from a country that has a relatively large amount of clout given our size, to make sure that we're using that in constructive ways for our allies. We've got 6 minutes left. I would just like to check whether there are other questions and just note that Anna's just noted that the Australian government delegation won't be at the Western this year, so we'll work out where they are. But I suspect that in previous years it's been important for us to know that because we've held the 5 p.m. briefings at their hotel. If it's too far away, we won't. We'll hold it at the UN building because that's where most people will be anyway. But have people got other questions about CSW and about what on earth you're going to do? Has everybody got their ESTA or their visa organised? If you're an Australian citizen who does not have a criminal record, you are probably eligible for an ESTA rather than needing a visa, which is a simpler process. But some people will need to apply for a visa and it's getting quite late to do that. So make sure that you've turned your attention to that. One thing that I think is interesting to keep in mind about CSW is that there is a significantly large group of people, and particularly of vulnerable women and girls, who can't engage at CSW. In particular, the fact that it's held in New York means that the rules about visas, some of the difficult rules that the US has around visas, makes it very difficult for some people simply to get into the country. It's also a difficult place to get around if you have a disability. And if you are a neurodivergent person, please come and talk to me separately. As a fellow neurodivergent person, I can give you tips about how to survive in a very un-neurodivergent-friendly environment. But disability access generally is poor. And so if you have a mobility disability in particular, make sure that you are allowing yourself significant extra time and that you might, if you've got time, pop around the various venues or look at them online and see what you think is going to be accessible to you. Yeah, Debbie's just pointing out that if you have criminal offences on your record, it'll take you months to get a visa, so you're probably a bit late at this stage. Hopefully most people will be able to get ESTAs, but it is a real point of exclusion, the visa problem, and there is an active debate at CSW about whether or not the event should be rotated around the world so that it's not so far from us every time, and not so far in particular from the Asia Pacific region, which often has lower attendance than other areas. You'll see high attendance from the EU, high attendance from Africa, high attendance from some parts of the Middle East, and from the Americas. But not so much. There is significant participation from Asia, but not as much as you might expect. And it tends to be in the first week. So some of those issues around exclusion are worth keeping an eye on. And I would encourage you to look around the rooms when you're there and think about who's not there. If you were somebody who wanted to talk about being a woman in prison, or somebody who wanted to talk about disability at CSW, it's just that much harder to get yourself there. So keep that in mind. Any other questions? Quick look at the chat. Okay, I'm going to use the last couple of minutes in a very cheeky way. So do feel free to leave if you have another event, but I do want to run you through some of the current flashpoints around what's likely to be debated at CSW and some of the things that we see all the time coming up that it's a good idea to be aware of. So this is just 3 last slides that I think might be quite useful to people. So this is sort of a couple of headlines about issues that we see coming up all the time. And for those of you who have been to CSW before, you'll know this. And for those of you who are involved in other international processes, some of this will feel very familiar because these are the general sticking points that we find on gender equality globally. Sexual and reproductive health rights versus reproductive health rights is a big one. We have to fight very hard to keep the word sexual in the text of the agreed conclusions every year. We don't always manage it. This is echoed in work that's done by UNFPA and other areas that comes under attack for focusing on the idea of women's sexuality. And heaven help you if you're talking about women, young women, adolescent girls and girls' sexuality, because that becomes a steaming hotbed of unhappiness. But we do try to push to keep references to sexual and reproductive health rights. Even the language around reproductive health rights is problematic and often gets tied to language around national sovereignty and local national context. And that's code for if we don't like abortion, we're not obliged to provide it or ensure access. Also, contraception can fall into that one sometimes. The Vatican and some of the Middle Eastern states are particularly vocal around the sexual piece, and the Vatican is very big on what it refers to as the rights of the family, and is very keen on excluding language about women's sexuality on the basis of protecting those rights of the family. Sexual orientation, gender identity and expression of sex characteristics is an area very close to my heart, and one which is the first to go every year. We have never managed to get any form of strong language in relation to any of those issues. The phrase LGBTIQA+ will be used at CSW, but it will be used by European people, people from Northern American countries and Australia. The more often used term at CSW is SOGI or SOGI-esque. We prefer SOGI-esque because it includes sex characteristics. And sorry, I saw a hand for a moment and then it was gone. Nope, okay, good. I'm going to charge on. So any support that you can give to LGBTI or SOGI-esque activists in this space is important. If you see someone wearing a rainbow lanyard in a room, do a quick scan every now and then and make sure they're okay, because you will see some bad behaviour at CSW, which is distressing. And there is a moment sometimes where just going over and being friendly to someone can be really helpful. So keep an eye out for those advocates. They're doing amazing work in a very hostile space. Same goes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or any Indigenous advocates. They can also come under some intense scrutiny in this space, so it's worth keeping an eye out for them too. Other language issues, the stuff around climate, whether we describe it as a crisis or whether we describe it as climate-related weather events or any of the other language that we're using to avoid any sense of urgency, which is a whole area in itself. The delegates from Pacific Island nations are the absolute experts in this area. We take their lead. If they tell us some language is acceptable or is not, it is follow them. That because they've been working very hard in this space, particularly in COP. Getting yourself familiar with the gender documents that came out of the last COP is a useful thing to do if you're interested in the area of climate and crisis. And I refer to them as climate and crisis because crisis covers a broader range of things, but climate weather events and infrastructure issues are a whole specific area we need to pay attention to. The role of civil society and women's organisations is another big area, and there's a big push to try to get more recognition of the role, particularly of feminist organisations and women human rights defenders in the documents. But that push is facing fairly strong pushback. We did get good language last year, and I see that some of that language has landed in the zero draft this year, so it's looking relatively good at this stage. But what sits under some of that work is that there is a pushback against the concept of women's human rights. What we're seeing instead, particularly at CSW, is a push to just have the word human disappear and the word women's rights then used instead. There's a calculation going on there. The idea is that if you make a sufficient gap between the idea of human rights and women's human rights, people will be more amenable to a position that the Vatican pushes very strongly, which is that there is a hierarchy of rights. They don't say it that bluntly, but that's what they mean. They talk about human rights, they talk about the rights of women, and in between those two, they talk about the rights of the family. And the unspoken narrative there is that women's human rights, or women's rights, are of lower value than the rights of the family. They're subordinate to them. So we are always pushing to talk about women's human rights because human rights are universal, indivisible, and need to be implemented in a way that meets the needs of women and girls across the world in different contexts. And that then brings us to women and girls. We lose girls all the time. Russia in particular doesn't like girls. They really don't like language about adolescent girls. And that's about patriarchal households, male-headed households, and the amount of control that they're allowed to have over their daughters' lives. There are other states that have other reasons for wanting to remove language about girls. But if you're with an organisation that is working on girls, that's being involved in the language negotiations would be really useful to us, because being able to talk to mid-tier states who are not as au fait with sort of why this language is being removed is really useful, because we need to be able to talk about the lived realities of girls' lives. So if that's an area your organisation works in, let me know. We want to be working with you on that. And last slide on this, just quickly. Language around the family keeps creeping in, and we bring it out and it keeps creeping in. Australia, again, plays a really important role in this space, because in particular, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists speak very eloquently and very effectively at CSW about kinship systems and about how the heterosexual nuclear family that is meant when people talk about the family is not the only family structure out there. The pressure on describing families or families in all their diversity is pressure around trying to exclude single-sex couples and their families. So it's very specifically a homophobic agenda and a transphobic agenda. But it then starts to have a knock-on effect for other forms of families, particularly kinship systems in Indigenous communities. So it's a really important one for us to be pushing back on. Comprehensive sexuality education. Basically, we usually end up with like 5 or 6 lines that describe what comprehensive sexuality education is, despite the fact that that term is a clearly defined one by the UNFPA. People want to specify that it will be age appropriate and that it will include consent and it will include this and that. So we'd like it just to say comprehensive sexuality education, because that then will bring in all the existing research and work around that. But what we end up seeing is huge descriptions, and our job is to comb through and make sure that nothing's been left out of that should be in it. The visibility of Indigenous women is particularly of concern this year. As I say, there was nothing in the zero draft. Intergenerational poverty and poverty linked to colonisation are completely sidelined in the draft. And so those are 2 areas that we're going to need to do some serious pushing on. Intersectionality and the list. So we've got to the point where CSW can now routinely churn out a paragraph that says we understand intersectionality occurs and we don't like it. That's a good thing. That's progress. The problem that we now have is that there is a tendency to want to list groups of women. I have a list of groups of women that we think are the bare minimum that need to be included in that list. But we prefer that if any of those groups are being excluded, that we don't use a list at all. Because what we do is we end up highlighting some groups and rendering other groups invisible as a result. And the obvious one with that is SOGI-esque. And so we tend to want to use language instead around women in all their diversity, or all women and girls, or women and girls in all their diversity. So pushing for language around that, and just making sure that when people are listing, when they're at events and that sort of thing, that you're listening for who's not coming up in those lists, because that starts to give you an idea. So for instance, Therese, I'm not sure I've ever seen single mothers regularly appear in those lists. If Deb's still on, no, she isn't. I've never, no, that's not true. Once or twice I've seen women in prisons come up in specific contexts, or women who have been criminalised, but it's very rare. Sex workers, again, rarely turns up. And so there are areas where we've still got lots of work to do. And I've mentioned it already, but language around national sovereignty. What do we actually, we will see paragraphs that talk about states having to do things, but only in their regional context, or only in accordance with local practices, or not in a way that impinges on the sovereignty of the state. The whole point about the UN is that everybody is signed up to the baseline. And frankly, the agreed conclusions are a baseline. And so language around national sovereignty is not acceptable, and we redline it. So that's a quick tour through some of the flashpoints that I see. There is a bit of a falling off of language around HIV/AIDS, which is interesting, and I'll be interested to see whether Africa goes back to push for that this time around. But language around how we deal with pandemics internationally, not really sitting there. Language around migrant and refugee women, we have to push for. Australia, I'm just seeing this still on the call. Australia's weak on that because we are not signed up to the Migration Convention yet. And we're not signed up to all the relevant ILO materials. So there's a point where we don't look to Australia, to the Australian delegation, to be doing that work. But we ourselves as NGOs are pushing it through other avenues to try to get it into the room. And where we think Australia might be taking a position that's unhelpful, we try to diffuse that. Having said that, everybody who is on the delegation is always gung-ho for including just about everything, because people who are interested in being on the Australian government delegation tend to be people who are sitting in a progressive space. And even though we've had governments over the last 10 years that haven't been tremendously helpful in any of the negotiation space, the negotiators themselves have always been brilliant. And it's worth remembering that Australia's position in this space is one of long-term relationships. So we negotiate with a group called the Mountains, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and essentially a group of states who are progressive, left, who don't all have mountains, but who do sit sort of outside the EU structure, outside, but who do, in a lot of cases, share a colonial history. So it's a little bit, it's Commonwealthy, but not Commonwealthy. So it's a funny grouping, but it's a grouping that has worked together well for decades. And so governments come and go, but the Mountains group persists. So if there's an area where you notice that Australia's not doing great stuff, what we can sometimes do is talk to the other members of the Mountain group and ask them to have a word with Australia. Alternately, we have a word with Australia and ask them, say to them, we understand your difficulties. Who else should we be talking to in the Mountains group about this? So there are ways around this for our negotiations. So if you're seeing stuff emerge from the language that you're concerned about, get it to the NGO groups through our WhatsApp chat, particularly if you're on the language group and you're seeing themes come up in the side events or in the parallel events, or you're hearing chatter from people you're talking to. Get that information into our communication channels because the Australian government's really good at staying in contact with us. And they're also really good at being realistic about what they can and can't do and finding us channels for where we might be able to pursue things that they're unable to carry for us. That's a really quick whistle-stop tour. There's another version of this presentation from a couple of years ago that's available online. So if anybody wants access to that, let me know. If anyone's not getting CSW emails from me, let me know because particularly if you're going, you'll need to be receiving those. In those emails, there are links to the WhatsApp groups. So you'll get another email from me this week that's just reminding you how to sign up for everything. And then you'll get another email from me after the pre-departure briefing next week on Tuesday, which will start to outline some of what we learnt from that pre-departure briefing, and will give you another chance to sign up for all those communication channels. And we'll put together an online summary of the events that Australians are holding. So if you're holding an event, do let us know, and we'll get that information all in one place so that Australians can find it. But also, if you have international networks, please do pass the Australian information out through those networks as well so that we can get that dialogue happening and we're not all just talking to each other in an echo chamber. Any last questions for the stayers? I am taking notes about who stayed. Well done.
We have a few questions in the chat about if people can expect to receive the slides, and I'm just going to anticipate a related question. Can people share slides and material from this presentation more widely?
I will send a version that can be shared widely, and I will give people access to a version which is everything that was in this. Some of the language stuff, we do try to keep a little close to our chest. One thing I haven't said a lot about, I've talked about what CSW is like for various different groups. CSW is a contested space, which features large numbers of people who are well-resourced and who do not agree with us about women's human rights. And those people do trawl for information about what our positioning is likely to be. I run the email list as an open list, so don't share anything on the email list that is strategically important to you. I will run the WhatsApp group on a slightly more selective basis. The WhatsApp group will be people whose positions would be uncontroversial in Australia. I do just want to say also that the WhatsApp group will be trans-friendly and will proceed on the basis that the human rights of all people and all women and girls are where we're coming from. And as the moderator of that group, I will not be tolerating anything that suggests that, for example, trans or non-binary or other people marginalised by gender who identify as women are not women. So there will be a little bit of policing of that, and I will do a little bit of editing around the slides as well. Anything else? More questions that occur to you? Contact me. Just email me, give me a call, contact me on WhatsApp, and I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm also very happy to put people in contact with people that I've come across who are working in similar areas. One of the things we will do at the pre-departure briefing is we will talk about who's working on what. So we'll use a whiteboard, we'll just get people to put their areas down and we'll try to clump people so that you get a bit of a sense of who might be your people on the ground at CSW or the people you've got on the ground at CSW while you're at home. So, Anna, did you? No, Anna was just saying bye, good. More training tomorrow at lunch. We'll keep it going. So thanks everybody for your time.
Thanks, Helen.
Cheers.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everybody. Bye.